Imagine being trapped in a thin nylon tent, miles away from civilization, while heavily armed strangers circle you in the pitch-black night, waiting for you to come out. That was the exact nightmare my friend Alex and I walked into. We picked a camping spot deep inside the national forest. I mean truly off the grid. It was miles away from any paved road, and you had to hike for hours just to reach the clearing. There was absolutely zero cell phone service out there. It was just the two of us, our heavy backpacks filled with gear, and the quiet sounds of nature. We spent the afternoon fishing in a crystal clear stream, catching a few small ones, and just laughing about our old college days. When the sun went down, we built a cozy campfire. We roasted hot dogs, cracked open a few cold drinks we had hauled all the way out there, and swapped stories about stupid things we did as teenagers. It felt like the perfect relaxing getaway. Eventually the fire burned down to glowing orange embers, and the deep chill of the woods set in. We crawled into our small two-man tent. Alex zipped up the mesh door, and we wriggled into our sleeping bags. "Night, man," Alex mumbled, already half asleep. "Sleep well," I replied. It was pitch black inside, the kind of darkness where you can't even see your own hand in front of your face. For a while, the only sounds were the crickets and the gentle rustling of dry leaves in the wind. But then, the atmosphere completely shifted. I heard a low, distant hum. At first I thought it was just an airplane flying high overhead, or maybe the wind playing tricks on my ears. But the hum didn't fade away. It grew louder, deeper. It started to sound like a heavy engine rumbling through the trees. I sat up in my sleeping bag, my heart doing a slow, heavy thump against my ribs. "Alex," I whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up. Do you hear that?" He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "Hear what?" By now, the hum had turned into a loud, aggressive roar. It was definitely a vehicle, but that made absolutely no sense. We were on a trail strictly meant for foot traffic only. No cars or trucks were allowed, and they shouldn't even be able to fit back here without tearing through the dense forest. Suddenly, blinding white headlights pierced through the tree line, illuminating our tiny tent like a glowing lantern. We both froze, completely paralyzed by confusion and fear. The roaring engine abruptly cut off, leaving a ringing silence that was immediately broken by the heavy slam of metal truck doors. Footsteps crunched aggressively against the dirt and dead leaves. It wasn't just one person, it was a group. "Who is that?" Alex whispered, his voice trembling in the dark. I covered his mouth with my hand, straining to listen. I could hear low, muffled voices, men, at least 2 or 3 of them, and they were less than 20 feet away from our heads. I slowly crept to the edge of the tent and peeked through the mesh window. I couldn't make out much in the stark shadows, but I saw the massive outline of a lifted pickup truck parked right at the edge of our campsite. One of the men struck a lighter to light a cigarette. The sudden flame illuminated his face for just a split second. He had a rough, thick beard, and his cold eyes were aggressively scanning the area. "What do we do?" Alex hissed, panic rising in his chest. "Stay completely quiet," I mouthed back. "Maybe they are just lost." But my gut screamed that this was a lie. You don't accidentally drive a massive truck miles off-road into the deep woods in the middle of the night. One of the men started walking directly toward our tent. A bright flashlight beam swept over the thin nylon fabric, and I held my breath so hard my lungs began to burn. "Hey, anyone in there?" A gravelly, rough voice called out. Alex and I stared at each other in the dark, our eyes wide with sheer terror. "Should we answer?" Alex mouthed. I aggressively shook my head. "No," the man called out again. "We saw your fire earlier, just checking if you boys are okay." But there was no kindness in his tone. It sounded like a trap, like he was testing us. Behind him, another man let out a low, sinister chuckle. The flashlight clicked off. The heavy footsteps walked back to the truck, but they didn't leave. We heard them rummaging through the truck bed. Metal clinked against metal. It sounded like tools, or worse, weapons. Minutes felt like agonizing hours. My mind went to the darkest places. Were they hunters, robbers, escaped convicts looking for victims in the woods? Then, the ultimate nightmare began. One of them started walking again, not toward the truck, but in a slow, deliberate circle around our tent. Crunch, crunch, crunch. "They're watching us," I whispered, my whole body shaking. The footsteps stopped right outside my side of the tent. A dry twig snapped. I could hear a man breathing heavily, just inches away from my face, separated only by a millimeter of fabric. "I know you're awake in there," A new chilling voice whispered directly through the tent walls. "Come on out and say hi." Alex grabbed my arm, squeezing it tight. I tapped my phone screen. No service. We were completely on our own with no way to call the police. When we didn't answer, the voice outside laughed softly. "Suit yourselves. We'll be out here all night." And they were. They kept us awake in pure terror all night with occasional coughs, heavy footsteps, and terrifying muffled conversations where I caught the words "easy pickings." When the first gray light of dawn finally broke, we knew we had to make a run for it. We silently stuffed our gear into our backpacks. I slowly unzipped the tent door and stepped out into the cold morning air. The three men were leaning against their muddy truck, drinking coffee from thermoses, staring directly at our spot. "Morning, boys," the leader mocked with a wicked grin. "Sleep well." "We're leaving," I said, my voice shaking as we bolted past them, leaving the tent behind. "No rush," one of them laughed. As we hit the trail, the biggest guy stepped in front of us, blocking the path. He had thick tattoos down his arms and a deep scar across his cheek. "You forgot something," he sneered, pointing at our tent. "Forget it," Alex snapped, trying to push past him. The big man grabbed Alex's shoulder violently. "Hey, mind your manners." I shoved the man's arm away. "Let him go," I yelled. The other two men closed in, forming a half circle around us. Their eyes were dead and cold, like they were genuinely enjoying this sick game. "What's the hurry?" the leader asked. "We could share breakfast." "No thanks," I said, my heart pounding out of my chest. We spun around and sprinted down the hiking trail as fast as our legs could carry us. Behind us, the men erupted into cruel laughter. A second later, the massive truck engine roared to life. "They're coming," Alex screamed. Tires tore up the dirt behind us. They were driving the truck directly down the narrow hiking trail, chasing us. Branches scraped violently against the truck's metal sides as they squeezed through. We dodged tree roots and rocks, our lungs burning with every breath. The truck horn blared right behind us, a terrifying, deafening sound. If we stayed on the trail, they were going to run us over. We finally hit a slightly wider section of the woods and dove off the path, scrambling into the thick, dense trees where the massive truck couldn't physically follow. We threw ourselves behind a massive fallen oak log, pressing our faces into the dirt, barely breathing. The truck screeched to a halt. Doors slammed. Heavy boots crunched into the woods. "Come out, come out," one of them sang in a twisted, playful voice. We stayed absolutely frozen. After what felt like an eternity of them searching the brush, they finally gave up. We heard them curse, get back in the truck, and reverse back up the trail. We waited for 2 solid hours before taking a completely different, miles-long detour back to the main highway, where we finally hitchhiked to safety with a passing forest ranger. We never went back for our tent. To this day, I still wake up in a cold sweat, hearing those footsteps circling me in the dark, and I always wonder what would have happened to us if we had unzipped that tent door when they first called out. Have you ever been told a terrifying campfire story, only to realize halfway through that the story is actually about you, and the monsters are watching you right at that very moment? The 70-mile trek, my 2 best friends, Alex and Jordan, and I had been planning this ultimate backpacking trip for years. We were going to conquer a brutal, beautiful 70-mile stretch of wilderness, starting from Echo Lake and ending at Donner Pass. It was supposed to take us 5 full days. We packed as light as humanly possible: tents, dehydrated food, and a small handgun, strictly for protection against wild animals like bears or mountain lions. The first day was a total breeze. We hiked past crystal clear waters and set up our first camp by the stunning Aloha Lake. On the second day, we really pushed our limits, climbing all the way up and over Dick's Pass. Even in the dead of summer, at 10,000 feet up, there were thick patches of snow on the ground. The views were completely breathtaking. We hiked a grueling 13 miles that day and collapsed into our sleeping bags, a foolish mistake. By the third day, the trail leveled out into beautiful open fields and dense green forests leading to Richardson Lake. We were feeling incredible. We built a roaring campfire, shared a few drinks, and just soaked in the absolute isolation. That's when Jordan pulled out a small plastic bag. He had brought along some dried wild fungi, just a little something to help us unplug and relax in the woods. "Want to try?" he asked with a smirk. Alex shrugged and took a piece. I only chewed a tiny bit, wanting to stay somewhat alert. But within an hour, a warm, hazy feeling washed over all of us. We couldn't stop laughing. We spent hours staring up at the massive blanket of stars. At one point, swept up in the wildness of it all, we actually stood up and started howling at the full moon like a pack of wolves. Our voices echoed loudly across the dark glass-like water of the lake. We thought we were completely alone. We were so wrong. The uninvited guest. The fourth day was brutal on our bodies. We hiked along high ridges with aching legs and blistered feet, but we kept pushing until we found a flat, dusty clearing to set up our final camp. We were exhausted but incredibly proud. We sat around the fire, eating our last hot meal. "This trip changed me," Alex said, happily poking the flames with a long stick. Jordan and I nodded. It was the best decision we had ever made. Crunch. Heavy footsteps dragged across the dry dirt just outside the ring of our firelight. We all snapped our heads up. A man slowly limped out of the pitch-black woods and into the orange glow of our camp. He looked incredibly rough. His clothes were filthy and hung loosely off his dangerously thin frame, but it was his face that made my blood run cold. One side of his cheek was sunken entirely inward, like a massive chunk of his jaw had been missing for decades. His eyes were small, sharp, and gleaming in the firelight, like a rat caught in a basement. "Mind if I join you?" he asked. His voice was a low, scratchy growl. We exchanged panicked glances, but Jordan, trying to keep things calm, spoke up. "Sure, man, have a seat." The stranger eased himself onto a dead log across the fire from us, aggressively rubbing his bad leg. "I've been hiking these hills my entire life," he muttered. "My family has deep roots out here, way back." Trying to be polite, I asked, "Are you out here all alone?" A slow, terrifying smile crept across his face, revealing jagged, uneven teeth. "Family is always close by." The fatal question. He tilted his head, his rat-like eyes scanning our gear. "You boys armed?" Alex shifted uncomfortably. That was a huge red flag. But thinking it would scare the man off, Alex answered honestly. "Yeah, we have a small pistol, for protection." The man let out a soft, wheezing chuckle. "Smart. The woods can turn bad real quick." Silence fell over the camp, a suffocating, heavy silence. He just sat there, staring blankly into the roaring fire, for what felt like an eternity, the flames casting twisted, dancing shadows across his deformed face. The suspense was making me sick to my stomach. Finally, he leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Want to hear a story? A true one, right from these very parts?" Jordan swallowed hard and nodded. "Go ahead." "The story that was about us." The man cleared his throat. "3 city boys, just like you, came hiking up this exact same trail. They started way down at Echo Lake. They pushed hard over Dick's Pass on day 2, and they rested up by Richardson Lake on day 3. And on the 4th night, they sat by a campfire, feeling mighty good about themselves. My skin erupted in goosebumps. My heart hammered against my ribs. How did he know our exact route?" But the man wasn't finished. "Those 3 boys, they had taken some special mushrooms the night before. They got real goofy. They even stood up and howled at the moon like absolute fools." Alex leaned over to me, his face completely pale. "That's us," he whispered in sheer terror. The stranger ignored him and kept speaking, his voice dropping to an icy whisper. Then a handsome stranger limped right into their camp. He sat down and asked if the boys were armed. They said yes, they had a small pistol. The stranger just laughed at them. He told them they were incredibly dumb for coming out here, and they were lucky to still be drawing breath. The man paused, locking his sharp eyes directly onto mine. One of the boys thought about grabbing that little pistol, but the stranger warned him not to. You see, the stranger told them that his cousins were hiding out there in the dark, and they had high-powered rifles pointed directly at the boys' heads. The man let that hang in the air. Then the man concluded, "See you around," the stranger said, and he limped away into the dark. The escape. Jordan was visibly shaking. That's our story." "How do you know that?" The man stood up slowly, his terrible limp even more obvious now. He grinned so widely that the sunken hole in his cheek pulled tight against his skull. "Because I'm that handsome stranger," he whispered, "and my family is watching you right now." We instantly leaped to our feet. I desperately scanned the tree line, but there was nothing but blinding blackness. The man slowly turned around and limped back into the shadows. As soon as he disappeared, the real nightmare began. Snap, rustle, crunch. The sounds of heavy footsteps and breaking branches erupted from the woods around us. It wasn't just coming from where the man had walked. It was coming from our left, our right, behind us. There were multiple people surrounding our campsite. "We need to go right now," Alex said, his voice completely breaking. We didn't even bother packing. We grabbed our backpacks, completely ignoring the tents and the burning fire, and bolted down the trail. We clicked on our flashlights and ran for our lives. As we sprinted into the darkness, a faint, chilling whisper floated out from the trees. "See you around." We didn't stop running. We pushed through those final agonizing miles in the pitch black, fueled by pure, unadulterated adrenaline. When we finally reached Donner Pass the next morning, we completely collapsed. We immediately found a park ranger and told him everything. He just sighed and said that drifters sometimes wander the trails. The police did a sweep of the area later, but found absolutely no one. Our tents and gear were just gone. We never ever hiked that path again. To this day, whenever I close my eyes, I see that twisted face glowing in the firelight. I hear those heavy footsteps surrounding us in the dark, and I am forced to wonder, what if his family really was out there? What if those rifles were aimed right at us, and we were just inches away from never coming home? If a stranger in the middle of nowhere warns you that people disappear when the screaming starts, do not wait around to find out if they are lying. Pack your things, start your engine, and run for your life. The wrong turn. Tom and I had rented a small, reliable car for a cross-country road trip. We packed the trunk to the brim with a heavy canvas tent, a cooler full of food, and 2 thick sleeping bags. We were young, adventurous, and trying to save money by camping instead of renting motels. One evening, the sun started dipping below the tree line much faster than we expected. We were exhausted, our eyes heavy from staring at the highway for 10 hours straight. We desperately needed a place to pull over and sleep. That was when we saw the weathered wooden sign for a campground just off the main road. The place looked completely abandoned. The front gate was rusted open, hanging lazily on broken hinges. We slowly drove the rental car through the entrance anyway, figuring a free, quiet spot was exactly what we needed. The road inside was brutally bumpy, completely swallowed by overgrown weeds and thick layers of dead, rotting leaves. After driving a little ways in, we noticed a few cheap, torn tents set up in a tight, strange circle. It looked like people were living there, but the entire area was dead quiet. No campfires, no talking, just an eerie, heavy silence. We decided to pick a spot a safe distance away from the circle and started unloading our gear in the fading twilight. The neighbors. As we were hammering the stakes into the hard dirt, 2 men emerged from the thick woods and walked directly toward our campsite. My stomach instantly tied into knots. They were shockingly thin, their clothes covered in dark, greasy stains. One of them wore a heavy gray hoodie zipped all the way up to his chin, despite the summer heat, with no shirt underneath. The other man had wild, matted hair and could not stop aggressively scratching at his own arms. "Hey, you guys new here?" the man in the hoodie asked. He spoke incredibly fast, his words blending together, and his bloodshot eyes darted frantically around our campsite like he was looking for something to steal. "Yeah, just stopping for the night," Tom said, standing up tall to project confidence. "Is this place actually open?" The sign out front looked pretty beat up. The other man let out a sharp, breathless laugh that lacked any real humor. "Open? Sure, man. It's open for folks like us. We're just here working on the trails. Seasonal stuff, you know. Name's Rick. This is Dave. I'm Tom. This is my girlfriend," Tom replied, putting a protective arm around my shoulder. I forced a polite smile, but my heart was racing. Their hands were visibly shaking and they couldn't stand still. They were twitching, shifting their weight from foot to foot. "You guys got any extra water?" Dave asked, taking an uncomfortable step closer to our cooler. "We're running real low." We quickly handed them a large bottled water, just wanting them to leave. They snatched it, muttered a quick thanks, and immediately turned back toward their circle of tents, whispering furiously to each other in hushed, frantic tones. I watched them walk away, noticing how they moved in quick, jerky motions like they were running out of time. The warning. We finished setting up and built a tiny fire just to cook some hot dogs. Tom and I sat shoulder to shoulder, staring into the flames. "This place feels entirely wrong," I whispered, glancing over my shoulder. "Those guys seem incredibly unwell, probably just tired from manual labor," Tom reasoned, though I could see his eyes scanning the dark woods. "We'll lock the car and leave at first light." Right as he said that, a beat-up white sedan pulled into the campground. Heavy thumping bass rattled the car's windows. It drove right up to the circle of tents, stopped for less than 30 seconds, and someone hopped out. They leaned into a tent, quickly hopped back into the car, and sped off into the night. It looked exactly like an illegal drop-off. 10 minutes later, an older woman walked over to our fire from a rusted pickup truck parked near the trees. She had stringy gray hair tied back in a messy bun, and a brutal hacking cough that sounded painful. "You kids shouldn't stay here," she rasped, her voice rough like sandpaper. "This ain't a safe spot." "What do you mean?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She leaned in, her eyes wide and serious. "Strange things happen out here at night. People act crazy, like they're not right in the head. Folks disappear sometimes, or they start violently fighting over absolutely nothing. If you hear screams, that's when you leave everything behind and run. I'm just telling you to watch your backs." She turned and walked away, coughing into her sleeve. I looked at Tom, completely terrified. "Maybe we should just sleep in the car," I pleaded. "It's getting too late to move everything," Tom whispered back, grabbing his heavy metal flashlight. "Let's just get in the tent, zip it up, and stay quiet. I'll keep this right next to me." Circling in the dark, we put out the fire and crawled into the tent, sealing the zipper tight. Tom held me close, but neither of us could close our eyes. Around midnight, a vicious argument erupted from the circle of tents. It was Rick and Dave. "You took it all," one of them screamed, his voice cracking. "Give it back right now." "Shut up, man," the other violently hissed. "They'll hear you." The shouting abruptly stopped, replaced by the terrifying sound of heavy boots crunching against the dead leaves. Someone was pacing. I nudged Tom in the pitch black. "Listen," I breathed. Tom slowly sat up. He unzipped our tent door just a fraction of an inch and peeked out into the dark. "I see one of them walking over to the old woman's truck," he whispered. Then, the footsteps changed direction. They were coming toward us. Crunch, pause, crunch. Whoever it was started walking in a slow, deliberate circle entirely around our tent. I held my breath, tears welling in my eyes. Why were they circling us? Then, the old woman started coughing again from inside her truck. Her door creaked open. "You got it?" a man's voice asked in the dark. It sounded like Dave. "Yeah, but keep your voice down," the old woman hissed back. "Those new kids over there might call the cops." My blood ran completely cold. This was not a campground. It was a hiding spot for dangerous people doing dangerous things. Tom and I lay frozen as the footsteps returned to our tent. Then a hand physically brushed against the thin nylon fabric right next to my head. I felt the pressure of their fingers sliding slowly along the tent wall. "We need to get out of here quietly," now Tom mouthed. The escape. We began frantically stuffing our sleeping bags into their sacks in the dark, trying not to make a single sound. Suddenly, the screaming started again, much louder this time. "You owe me," Rick roared from his tent. A zipper violently tore open, and heavy footsteps stormed out into the dirt. I leaned forward and peeked through the tiny gap in our tent zipper. Rick was marching toward the old woman's truck, his face twisted in pure rage. But halfway there, he stopped dead in his tracks. He slowly turned his head and stared directly at our tent. He locked eyes with me right through the tiny gap in the zipper. He knew we were watching. He held my gaze for 3 agonizing seconds before marching toward the woman's truck. He climbed inside the cab with her, and thick smoke began billowing out of the cracked windows. Dave stepped out of his tent and stood perfectly still in the dark, staring at our campsite like a guard dog. "Tom," he saw me. I panicked. "Leave the tent," Tom ordered. "Grab the keys." We run to the car on 3. 1, 2, 3. We burst out of the tent, abandoning our gear, and sprinted to the rental car. We slammed the doors and locked them instantly. Tom jammed the key into the ignition and twisted it. The engine roared to life. He slammed his foot on the gas, but the car just loudly revved in place. It wouldn't move. "The brake!" I screamed. "The parking brake is on." Tom cursed, violently yanking the emergency brake release. The car lurched backward into the dirt. As we spun the steering wheel to face the exit, the headlights of the old woman's truck flashed on, blinding us with high beams. Then, a scream shattered the night. It wasn't an angry scream. It was a high, sharp, blood-curdling shriek of pure agony. Someone was being hurt. "Drive," I sobbed. Tom floored the gas pedal. The rental car bounced violently over the massive ruts and leaves, tires spinning in the dirt before finally catching traction. I looked in the rearview mirror and saw two dark figures sprinting down the road after our car, chasing us through the blinding dust until we finally hit the paved highway and left them behind. The agonizing screams faded into the distance. We drove straight through the night until we found a bright, well-lit bed and breakfast in a small, populated town. When we told the owner where we had stopped, her face turned pale. "That old campsite has been permanently closed for almost a decade," she said softly. "Awful people hide out back there. They do heavy drugs and worse. The police don't even like going down that road at night." We exchanged our rental car the very next morning, terrified they had memorized our license plate. I still think about that night constantly. What if we had fallen asleep? What were they actually doing to that old woman in the truck? The way they watched us in the dark, the horrifying scream of pain as we drove away, it haunts me. We barely escaped with our lives, and we left a piece of our sanity behind in those woods.